At my sister's MBA graduation, she laughed. My sister's still waitressing at 35. Guess brains aren't genetic. Our father added, one success, one failure. The dean stepped forward, cleared his throat. I'll tell you who paid your tuition, and who owns this university. The diploma in her hand started shaking. The parking lot was already half full when I pulled up in my beat-up Honda Civic. I watched a sleek BMW pull into the spot next to mine, the driver stepping out in a perfectly tailored suit. His wife emerged wearing pearls that probably cost more than I made in 3 months of waiting tables. They walked toward the university entrance with that confident stride that screamed success. I smoothed down my department store dress and grabbed the small gift bag from my passenger seat. Inside was a silver pen engraved with Emily's initials. Nothing fancy, but it had taken me 2 weeks of extra shifts to afford it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was celebrating my sister's achievement in business school while I couldn't even afford to go back to school myself. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families claimed their seats. I chose the second row, close enough to show support but far enough back to avoid the spotlight. Around me, parents clutched programs and adjusted their cameras. A woman beside me was already tearing up, and the ceremony hadn't even started. My daughter's the first in our family to get an MBA, she whispered to her husband. I'm so proud I could burst. I nodded politely, wondering what that kind of unconditional pride felt like. My own father had arrived 10 minutes after me, scanning the room before settling 2 seats away. He acknowledged me with a brief nod, the same greeting he might give a distant acquaintance. Didn't think you'd make it, he said, not quite looking at me. Figured you'd have to work. I requested the day off weeks ago. Kept my voice steady. No point in explaining that I'd actually switched shifts with 3 different coworkers to be here. He grunted and turned his attention to his phone. The empty seat between us felt like a canyon. I remembered Emily's high school graduation, how he'd saved the seat next to him for me, how we'd cheered together when her name was called. That was before my life had taken what he considered the wrong turn. The processional music began and graduates filed in wearing their caps and gowns. Emily looked radiant in her navy blue regalia, her blonde hair perfectly styled beneath her cap. She'd always been the golden child, straight A's, student council president, homecoming queen. The trajectory from high school success to MBA had been as predictable as sunrise. She spotted me almost immediately, and that familiar smirk spread across her face. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd gotten into her dream college while I'd dropped out to care for our sick mother. The same look when she'd landed her internship at a prestigious firm while I'd been promoted to head waitress at Mel's Diner. Emily whispered something to the graduate next to her, who glanced in my direction and stifled a laugh. My cheeks burned, but I'd learned long ago not to react. Giving Emily a response was like feeding a stray cat. It only encouraged her to come back for more. The dean stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium. Welcome, families and friends, to this celebration of academic excellence and dedication. The crowd settled into respectful silence. I watched the ceremony unfold with mixed emotions. Part of me was genuinely proud of Emily's accomplishment. Getting an MBA was no small feat, and despite our complicated relationship, she was still my sister. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would somehow be used against me later. As names were called alphabetically, I found myself studying the other families. The couple next to me held hands tightly, both beaming with joy. Behind me, grandparents had traveled from out of state, clutching tissues and whispering about how smart their granddaughter was. Everyone seemed to belong here except me. When Emily's name was announced, she walked across the stage with practiced grace. The dean shook her hand warmly, and she posed for photos with the same confidence she'd always possessed. I clapped enthusiastically, even raising my hands higher so she could see my support from the audience. But Emily's eyes found mine and held them for just a moment too long. There was something calculating in her gaze, like she was already planning her next move in whatever game we'd been playing since childhood. Dad pulled out his phone to record the moment, his face finally showing some animation. "That's my daughter," he said to the stranger beside him, his voice carrying pride I hadn't heard directed toward me in years. The ceremony continued, but I barely heard the remaining names. Something was building in the air, a tension I couldn't quite identify. Emily kept glancing in my direction during the dean's closing remarks, and each time she did, that smirk grew wider. As the graduates threw their caps in celebration, I felt a chill run down my spine. The day wasn't over yet, and somehow I knew Emily wasn't finished with her performance. She'd always been theatrical, always loved an audience. And today she had the biggest stage of her life. I clutched the gift bag tighter, wondering if I should have stayed home. The reception area buzzed with congratulations and camera flashes as families gathered around their graduates. I hung back near the refreshment table, watching Emily work the room like a politician. She moved from group to group, accepting praise and posing for photos, her diploma clutched proudly in her manicured hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," the dean's voice crackled through the sound system. "We'd like to invite a few of our distinguished graduates to share their thoughts about their journey here." Emily's eyes lit up. She'd always loved being the center of attention, and this was her moment to shine. She practically glided to the microphone, adjusting it with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "Thank you, Dean Morrison," she began, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness she'd perfected over the years. "This has been an incredible journey, and I'm so grateful to the amazing faculty who challenged me every step of the way." The audience nodded approvingly. Parents smiled at their phones as they recorded every word. Emily basked in the attention, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I also want to thank my brilliant classmates," she continued, gesturing toward the other graduates. "The caliber of minds in this program is just extraordinary. Working alongside such talented individuals has pushed me to excel beyond what I thought possible." More applause. Dad had moved closer, positioning himself where Emily could see his proud smile. He was practically glowing with satisfaction, his chest puffed out like a peacock showing off its feathers. Then Emily's expression shifted slightly and I felt my stomach tighten. There was a mischievous glint in her eyes that I recognized from childhood, the same look she'd get right before she'd tell Mom about some minor rule I'd broken. "You know," Emily said, her tone becoming more conversational, "education has always been valued in our family. Well, mostly." She paused for effect and a few people chuckled uncertainly. "My sister's still waitressing at 35, so I guess brains aren't genetic after all." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Not the polite chuckling from earlier, but genuine amusement at my expense. I watched faces in the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, but others were genuinely entertained by Emily's casual cruelty. A woman near the front stage whispered to her husband, "Did she really just say that about her own sister?" But her tone suggested she was more amused than appalled. Dad, emboldened by Emily's boldness and the crowd's reaction, decided to add his own commentary. He turned to the family sitting in front of him, the Johnsons whose son had also graduated today. "Well, you know how it is," Dad said, his voice carrying just far enough for several rows to hear. "One success, one failure. That's just how life works out sometimes." Mrs. Johnson looked mortified, but Mr. Johnson actually nodded knowingly, as if Dad had shared some profound wisdom about parenting. My face burned with humiliation, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. Years of Emily's barbs had taught me that any reaction would only fuel the fire. The worse I felt, the more satisfied she became. So I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my eyes fixed on Dean Morrison. But inside something crystallized. For years I'd absorbed their casual cruelty, their dismissive comments, their assumption that my life was somehow less valuable than theirs. I told myself it didn't matter, that their opinions couldn't hurt me anymore. I was wrong. It did hurt. But more than that, it ignited something I'd been keeping carefully controlled. Emily continued her speech, talking about leadership and innovation and seizing opportunities. She spoke about the importance of education in opening doors and creating possibilities. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'm excited to take everything I've learned here and apply it in the real world," she concluded. "Thank you again for this incredible opportunity." More applause. Emily practically floated back to her spot among the other graduates, high-fiving classmates and soaking up their congratulations. Dad was beaming like he'd personally earned the MBA himself. I watched Emily pose for more photos, her diploma held high like a trophy. She looked so certain of her superiority, so confident in her place above me in the family hierarchy. The golden child with the advanced degree, while her older sister scraped by serving coffee and burgers to pay rent. Dean Morrison returned to the microphone to make closing remarks about the ceremony, but I barely heard him. My mind was racing, calculating, remembering conversations from board meetings they'd never know I'd attended. Reviewing financial documents they'd never seen. Considering the delicious irony of their complete ignorance. Emily had no idea that every scholarship check she'd received had my signature on the authorization. Dad didn't know that his failure of a daughter had personally approved his precious golden child's admission to this very program. They wanted to perform for this crowd? They wanted to paint me as the family disappointment while they took their bows? Perfect. Let them have their moment in the spotlight. Because what they didn't realize was that this wasn't Emily's stage at all. It was mine. I'd built it, funded it, and controlled every aspect of it. They were just actors who didn't know they were following a script I'd written. The reception began winding down, but I didn't move from my spot. I was exactly where I needed to be, watching them celebrate their perceived victory while sitting in the shadow of the empire they'd never suspected I'd built around them. Emily caught my eye across the room and gave me that same smirk, probably thinking she'd delivered the perfect final blow to her disappointing older sister. She had no idea what was coming next. I slipped out of the reception early, claiming I needed to get back to work for the dinner shift. Dad barely acknowledged my goodbye, too busy networking with other parents about their children's accomplishments. Emily was surrounded by admirers, so I didn't even attempt to interrupt her moment of glory. Walking to my car, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a familiar contact. Dean Morrison? It's me. How did the ceremony go from your perspective? I kept my voice low, glancing around the parking lot to make sure no one could overhear. Beautifully executed as always. His voice came through clearly. Though I must say your sister's comments were rather pointed. I laughed softly. She has no idea who she was really talking about, does she? None whatsoever. Are you still planning to move forward with tomorrow's revelation? More than ever, I said, climbing into my Honda. I'll see you at 8 a.m. sharp for the final preparations. The drive home took me past the factory where David had worked for 12 years. The memorial garden we'd built after the accident was blooming with spring flowers now, a small plaque bearing his name among the 17 others who'd lost their lives that day. The wrongful termination lawsuit had taken 3 years to settle, but when it finally came through, the amount had been staggering. Everyone assumed I'd used the money to pay off David's medical bills and maybe put a little aside for emergencies. What they didn't know was that David had been incredibly insurance savvy. His life insurance, the settlement, and our savings had given me nearly $2 million to work with. While I grieved my husband, I'd also been studying financial reports late into the night. The local university had been struggling for years. Declining enrollment, aging facilities, a reputation that was slowly crumbling. The board of trustees was desperate for an investor, someone willing to take risks that traditional donors wouldn't consider. I'd started small, attending public budget meetings under the guise of a concerned community member. Nobody questioned the quiet woman in the back row taking notes. I learned about their debt structure, their failed marketing campaigns, their inability to attract quality faculty because of budget constraints. The first meeting with the board had been terrifying. I'd worn my best dress, the same one I'd worn to David's funeral, and carried a briefcase I'd bought specifically for the occasion. My hands had shaken as I'd presented my proposal to purchase controlling interest through a private foundation. Mrs. Henderson, the board chair had said, studying my financial documents with barely concealed surprise. This is quite generous, but we need to understand your motivations. What exactly do you hope to gain from this investment? I'd practiced the answer countless times. My late husband believed education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty. I want to honor his memory by ensuring this institution can serve students who might not otherwise have opportunities for higher education. They'd bought it completely. The Clare Foundation, named after David's middle name, which I'd never mentioned to anyone in my family, became the university's primary private benefactor within 6 months. The real work had begun after the paperwork was signed. I'd spent my days waitressing and my evenings poring over academic journals, researching successful university turnaround strategies. I'd flown to conferences during my vacations, networking with education consultants and innovative administrators. Within the first year, we'd recruited Dr. Patricia Hernandez from Stanford to head our new sustainable business program. I'd personally courted her during a 3-hour dinner meeting in San Francisco, convincing her that our small university could become a model for rural education excellence. The scholarship program had been my favorite project. Every application crossed my desk for final approval, including one that had made me smile wider than I had in years. Emily's application had been marginally qualified at best. Good grades but nothing exceptional. Her essay about overcoming challenges through family support had been particularly ironic. I'd approved it anyway, curious to see if proximity to genuine academic excellence might humble her. Instead, she'd thrived in the environment I'd created, never once questioning how a struggling university had suddenly acquired world-class resources. The late-night strategy sessions with Dean Morrison had become a highlight of my weeks. I'd change out of my uniform in the restaurant bathroom, drive to his office and spend hours discussing curriculum development and faculty recruitment. He'd been initially skeptical of taking direction from someone without formal business education, but my results had quickly earned his respect. "You have an intuitive understanding of institutional dynamics," he told me after our first successful accreditation review. "Have you ever considered pursuing formal education yourself?" I'd laughed at the suggestion. "I prefer working behind the scenes." By year 3, our enrollment had doubled. We'd established partnerships with major corporations for internship programs. Our graduation rate had jumped from 62% to 89%. Education journals were writing articles about our miraculous transformation, though they attributed it to innovative leadership and community support. The hardest part had been maintaining my double life. Some mornings I'd go straight from board meetings to opening shifts at the diner, my mind still buzzing with budget projections while I poured coffee for truckers and retirees. My coworkers occasionally commented on how tired I looked, but they assumed I was just struggling financially. Emily had called me exactly twice during her entire enrollment. Once to complain about her roommate and once to ask if I could lend her money for textbooks. I'd transferred $500 to her account, money that had technically come from the Foundation's emergency student fund. "Thanks, sis," she'd said. "I promise I'll pay you back once I graduate and get a real job." A real job. As if the enterprise I'd built from scratch wasn't real enough. Now sitting in my driveway, I looked at my modest house with new eyes. Tomorrow the carefully constructed walls between my two worlds would finally come down. Emily and Dad would learn exactly who had been funding their golden child success story. My phone buzzed with a text from Dean Morrison. "Final donor recognition list approved. Are you ready for this?" I typed back quickly, "More ready than they'll ever be." The next morning arrived with unexpected rain, drumming against my bedroom window as I prepared for what would become the most important day of my adult life. I'd barely slept, running through every possible scenario in my mind. By 7:30, I was dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to David's funeral and every major board meeting since. The university's main conference room buzzed with anticipation when I arrived. Today's gathering wasn't just about celebrating yesterday's graduates. It was the annual donor recognition ceremony, a tradition Dean Morrison and I had established 3 years ago to honor the Foundation's major contributors. Emily had texted me that morning, "Thanks for coming yesterday. Sorry if my speech was a bit much. You know how I get when I'm nervous." The casual dismissal of her cruelty was so typically Emily that I'd almost laughed out loud. I'd responded simply, "See you at the donor ceremony. 10 a.m. sharp." She'd sent back a confused emoji. "Donor ceremony? Why would I go to that?" "Trust me. You'll want to be there." Now, watching families file into the elegant room, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The Johnsons were there. Mr. Johnson still chuckling about Dad's "one success, one failure" comment from yesterday. Several other families who'd witnessed Emily's performance had also accepted invitations to this exclusive recognition event. Emily arrived looking puzzled but perfectly put together in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She spotted me immediately and walked over with that familiar mixture of confusion and condescension. "What exactly is this about?" she asked, glancing around at the formal setup. "And why are you here? Did you cater this or something?" Before I could answer, Dad appeared beside her, equally bewildered. "I got a call this morning saying I was specifically invited to recognize my family's contribution to the university. I don't understand what contribution they're talking about." Dean Morrison stepped to the podium, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. The room gradually quieted as he adjusted the microphone and surveyed the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, Thank you for joining us today for a very special recognition ceremony. Yesterday's graduation was a celebration of individual achievement, but today we honor the generosity that makes such achievements possible. Emily shifted beside me, clearly uncomfortable with the formal atmosphere. Several of her classmates had also been invited, including the ones who'd laughed loudest at her jokes about my career choices. The past 4 years have witnessed an unprecedented transformation of this institution, Dean Morrison continued. Through the vision and commitment of a single benefactor, we've gone from struggling to survive to becoming a model of educational excellence. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Parents exchanged glances, probably wondering which wealthy philanthropist had been secretly supporting their children's education. This transformation wasn't accomplished through traditional means. Our primary benefactor chose to work anonymously, through a private foundation, asking for no recognition and accepting no public praise. His eyes found mine across the room. Until today. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. Emily was still looking around the room, probably trying to spot some elderly millionaire she could network with after the ceremony. The Clare Foundation has contributed over $3.2 million to this university, Dean Morrison announced, and the room erupted in surprised whispers. This foundation has funded our scholarship programs, recruited our faculty, upgraded our facilities, and personally reviewed every significant decision that has shaped our academic excellence. Dad straightened in his chair, suddenly paying much closer attention. Emily's eyes had widened with what looked like genuine interest, probably calculating how she could leverage this information for her own benefit. Every student who has received financial aid in the past 4 years, the dean continued, his voice growing stronger, has been directly supported by the Clare Foundation. Every scholarship, every emergency fund distribution, every work-study position has been made possible through this single source of generosity. Emily's face had gone pale. She was smart enough to do the math. Her entire education had been subsidized by whoever ran this mysterious foundation. Today, for the first time, the foundation's sole owner and director has agreed to be publicly recognized. Dean Morrison paused, letting the anticipation build. The Clare Foundation was established and has been operated entirely by someone you all know well. The room fell completely silent. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the moment. The woman who has quietly transformed this institution while working multiple jobs to support herself, who has never asked for recognition or reward, who has given everything to ensure that students like your children could succeed. He paused, his eyes meeting mine directly. Please join me in recognizing Mrs. Sarah Henderson, founder and sole benefactor of the Clare Foundation. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the rain against the windows, someone's sharp intake of breath. Slowly I stood up, my legs steadier than I'd expected them to be. Emily's mouth had fallen open. She was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, her brain clearly struggling to process what she'd just heard. Dad had gone completely rigid, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. The room began to buzz with whispers. The waitress, someone murmured. She owns the foundation? Another voice asked incredulously. Mrs. Johnson leaned toward her husband, stage whispering, Isn't that the woman whose family was making fun of her yesterday? Dean Morrison gestured for me to join him at the podium, but I shook my head slightly. I didn't need to make a speech. The revelation itself was enough. Instead, I simply nodded to acknowledge the recognition and sat back down. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Emily's diploma program slipping from her trembling fingers and hitting the floor. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah? Is this real? I met his eyes for the first time in years without looking away. Every word. The silence in that conference room had stretched on for what felt like an eternity before people began to leave. I watched Emily gather her fallen program with shaking hands, her usual composure completely shattered. Dad remained frozen in his chair, staring at me like he was seeing a stranger. Sarah, Emily finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you. But I was already walking toward the exit, my business finished for the day. I'm sure you do, I said without turning around. But I have a shift at the diner in an hour. That evening, Dean Morrison and I met at the small cafe across from campus. The same place where we'd had our first conversation about transforming the university 4 years ago. He ordered his usual black coffee while I stirred cream into mine, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting," he said, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "They want to discuss the transition protocols." I nodded, having expected this. "And Emily's account status?" "That's what I wanted to discuss." He slid a financial statement across the table. "According to our records, she has one remaining loan payment of $90,000. The foundation has been covering her monthly installments, but that coverage ends immediately," I finished for him. "Transfer the debt to Henderson Financial Services. She'll receive notification within the week." Dean Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Sarah, are you certain about this? It's a substantial amount." I sipped my coffee, tasting the familiar bitterness that had sustained me through countless late nights of planning. She earned every penny of that debt with yesterday's speech. Consider it a final lesson in consequences. Within 10 days, Emily's world began to unravel in the most methodical way possible. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, official letterhead from Henderson Financial Services, a company she'd never heard of but which now held her educational future in its hands. I was restocking napkin dispensers at the diner when my phone buzzed with her call. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her increasingly frantic message while wiping down tables. "Sarah, I got this letter about my loan and I don't understand. They're saying I owe $90,000 to some company, but my loans were supposed to be forgiven through the scholarship program. Can you call me back? Please." 3 more calls came that day. I ignored them all. Emily showed up at the diner on Thursday evening, looking haggard and desperate. She slid into a corner booth and waited until my section cleared out before approaching the counter. "We need to talk," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I continued filling salt shakers. "I'm working. You can see that. Sarah, please. I'm drowning here. This debt came out of nowhere and I can't make these payments on my starting salary. I don't even understand how this happened." I finally looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "The same way everything else in your life happened, Emily. Someone else paid for it." Her face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little sister I'd once protected from neighborhood bullies. "I know I said some horrible things at graduation. I was nervous and trying to be funny and it came out wrong. I'm sorry." "You're not sorry about what you said," I replied, returning to my work. "You're sorry about the consequences." The truth was, I'd spent weeks crafting this particular consequence. Henderson Financial Services was a subsidiary I'd created specifically for this purpose, with payment terms that would ensure Emily thought of me every single month for the next 15 years. She would write my name on every check, return my calls when payment was late, and navigate the automated phone system that would always route her to my personal extension. Every financial milestone in her new career would be measured against her debt to the sister she'd dismissed as a failure. Dad tried to intervene the following week, calling me for the first time in 2 years. "Sarah, honey, I think there's been some mistake with Emily's loans. Can you look into it through your connections?" His careful tone told me he still didn't fully grasp the extent of my involvement. To him, I was still the waitress who'd somehow stumbled into a position of minor influence. "It's not a mistake, Dad," I said, watching the lunch rush through the diner's front window. "Emily received exactly what she earned. But $90,000? That's her entire starting salary. Then she'll need to budget carefully." The family barbecue that 4th of July was unlike any we'd had in decades. Emily arrived late and spoke only when directly addressed. Dad spent most of the afternoon making awkward small talk, clearly unsure how to navigate this new dynamic where his failure daughter held all the cards. Uncle Frank, who'd driven in from Phoenix, kept shooting me curious glances. "So this foundation thing," he finally said over burgers, "that's really something special you've built there." Emily stared at her plate, probably calculating how many of these monthly gatherings she'd have to endure while making payments to me. "It started small," I said, passing the potato salad. "Just wanted to help students who might not otherwise have opportunities." "Well, it's incredible what you've accomplished," Aunt Marie chimed in. "Emily's so lucky to have benefited from your generosity." The word lucky hung in the air like smoke. Emily excused herself to the bathroom shortly after, and I could hear her making a phone call through the window, probably to her new financial advisor, trying to figure out refinancing options that didn't exist. When she returned, her eyes were red-rimmed but determined. She sat down across from me and spoke quietly so the others couldn't hear. "I know you hate me right now and I probably deserve it. But I need you to know that I'm going to pay every penny of this debt. I won't ask you to forgive it or reduce it. I'll work extra jobs if I have to." For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt something other than satisfaction. Maybe it was respect or maybe just surprise at her maturity. "Good," I said simply. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." As the evening wound down, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in our family dynamic. Emily no longer dominated conversations or made casual jokes at others' expense. Dad asked thoughtful questions about my work instead of making assumptions about my intelligence. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the family disappointment. I was the family mystery, the quiet sister who'd built an empire while they weren't paying attention. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death: peace. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the deeper contentment that comes from being truly seen and respected for who you really are. The monthly payment reminders would continue, but they weren't really about the money anymore. They were about remembering that everyone deserves dignity, and that underestimating people can be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make. Sometimes the people we underestimate hold the greatest power. Sarah's quiet strength reminds us that everyone deserves respect and dignity. What was your favorite moment in this incredible journey of hidden strength and family transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more inspiring tales that touch the heart.